Greetings, comrades, and welcome to The Southwest is Red, the podcast in which we discuss the latest news about the Global South from a Latin American perspective, with a Chinese twist. I'm one of your hosts, Pedro.
And I'm your co host, Nico. We are recording this episode in the midst of another escalation of the conflict in the Middle East. Israel and the US decided to open another front, this time attacking Iran. As you probably know, the situation is highly volatile, and this leads to all kinds of discourse, with the quality that we are used to seeing in the internet.
My friend, quality is not something I expect from the internet. I think no one expects quality from the internet, no? Even more so in times of AI slop. But I get what you're saying. It's difficult for us to talk about these topics without the episode becoming obsolete even before it's published. On the other hand, we are not a news service, so we can use these events to talk about warfare in more general terms. What do you think?
Exactly. Our objective here is to provide some deep analysis that goes beyond our immediate experiences into critical reflection that can lead the way to concrete action. And the topic of war provides very interesting material for that.
It can be confusing sometimes to know what to think about warfare because of the amount of the hype, misinformation, and lies that are running around. So I hope this episode can provide some clarity or at least contribute to promote the kind of thinking that you are describing.
I hope so too. And if you agree, we can jump into it directly. So, the first topic for today is the relationship between technology and warfare. And I honestly believe this is a perfect subject because there is no other field that is more subjected to this hype, misinformation, and lies phenomenon. Right now, we're seeing that with AI because we're being told that one of the fields in which AI will change everything is warfare. I've got a couple of questions for you regarding that. The first one is, how is AI or automation changing warfare? And more broadly, what are the impacts of those changes?
This is a good question because AI is changing warfare, but not in the way that people think. The big problem for me is that a lot of people can't make the distinction of a technology that is okay, that's my choice of word. A technology that is cool from one that is truly revolutionary. And everyone is trying to paint AI as something that is truly revolutionary, which is not. I'm not saying it's an easy task to make this distinction. It's not. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It's easier to fall for the greater the damage, the better the weapon is. I totally get it. But in reality, things are not that simple. When it comes to military strategy, you have a lot of factors to analyze in order to have a better idea about what is the good side of a weapon, what are the flaws of the innovation that you are trying to support. We don't have that with AI yet.
That's a great point, and I think one of the aspects that make this conversation more difficult in the case of AI is that the people who are promoting AI hype are unable to distinguish between present capabilities and future possible capabilities. What do I mean with this? That the discussion about AI is based on what AI could do in the future. But actually, these hype profits are very inaccurate. And one other thing is that this is described by some, like for example in Empire of AI by Karen Howe, as a conscious strategy by AI companies, because in order to avoid regulation of AI now, they keep talking about regulation of possible future development, like AGI, or what if AI becomes so powerful that it will do this or that. And in that way, they push the problem to the future instead of focusing on regulating what actually exists.
I think this is one topic that we can discuss later, right? How people are more worried about future problems than what is in front of them. But I have a take for this. Having an idea that a weapon is going to change and then the reality proves you totally wrong. Let's go back to the 19th century when Maxim, he developed the Maxim gun, the first machine gun. Everyone was thinking that it would give fantastic offensive capabilities and wars would be over in a matter of seconds. But at the same time, the half of the 19th century, we got more efficient repeating rifles and better fire control in artillery. So this impression that wars were going to be quick got stronger. But if you're fighting against someone who doesn't possess this kind of weapons, then yeah, okay, you're going for a quick campaign. But what happens when both sides have the good choice? We know, right? There's a nice paper from Barton Hacker that sums up what happened in World War One. I think our listeners, they have an idea, but let me quote him. Maneuver vanished in trenches and operations took on the guise of a gigantic siege. Well, that's precisely what happened in World War One. It became a siege, right? A huge siege that was interconnected by trenches. So battles stopped to be a decisive encounter, and it became a muddy competition of who could dig more holes, install more barbed wire fences. Everyone who tried to advance was stopped by a rate of fire with no historical precedent at the time. What I'm trying to say is that the weapon designed to be offensive and change the face of warfare, it changed the face of warfare, but the war became defensive. So this is a great case of failed predictions, and failed prediction with a huge human cost.
Yeah, and a little bit of irony, no? Because it's like what is predicted became the opposite of what happened.
Yeah.
Another example is Giulio Dohet, who was an Italian military thinker, and usually he's called a prophet even now, because he made several predictions regarding how airplanes will change the future of war. The interesting thing is not so much that he was right in the fact that airplanes would change warfare, which for us is at this point is an obvious fact. But how did he say it would change it? He said wars would become shorter, casualties would be reduced. So yeah, not very accurate on the details, we could say. And we see similar patterns in predictions about AI. When we discuss how it changes war, it may seem that the changes are actually pretty small, but it is misleading. So, an important transition we need to do is turn from thinking about what AI could do to what AI is doing or how are we using AI right now. In that realm, it seems to me that targeting and recognition software and lethal autonomous weapons like drones are the real issues. This is still a lot though. And we're talking about technology that is actually being deployed right now in Gaza, for example. And in a recent New York Times article on that topic, it is possible to see that the use that Israel is giving to AI is very haphazard and it creates a lot of what is usually called collateral damage. And this raises many ethical issues, I think.
Since you mentioned ethical issues, I would like to go for that. We know, at least I'm more familiar with the changes that AI can do in tactics, strategies, and so on. But what about the accountability question, the ethical question? What I want to say is there is no Will Smith to go after the robots that commit crimes. So we should be discussing that.
In my readings on the topic, I think there are two main ways in which these kind of ethical dilemmas that AI using warfare presents have been discussed. And one series of discussions, or one topic, or one way of discussing could be called absolute. In the absolute debate, the main question is if it is ethical to use AI in warfare at all. And here the concept of accountability is crucial. For example, what happens if an AI commits a war crime? Who is going to be responsible for it? On this, I think that although it may seem counterintuitive, actually it's a change that can be thought as beneficial. If the person who made the decision to deploy the AI would be construed as legally responsible for its effect. But in fact, what will probably happen, and we already see this with many previous technological developments, is that AI will be used as a way to avoid responsibility, to avoid accountability, because they will allege that any crimes committed by an AI are machine error. Furthermore, the use of AI in the ways in which Israel is using it in Gaza also continues the process of normalization of the method of assassination that has characterized the military doctrine of the US in the last 20 years at least, and the related civilian casualties that are a trademark of the use of drones.
The big problem that I have with the absolute ethical dilemma is that the only solution that I can imagine is a Dune like scenario.
What's the Dune like scenario? Are these people going to take drugs in the desert and find the Harkonnens?
Oh my god. Some of them they are. But I'm talking about abandoning computers and people doing crazy math like the shushu we see in the supermarket. Because how to control this? You are not going to the Pentagon right now and say, okay, it's time to stop using AI for killing. It's not good. But, anyways, talking seriously, we have some initiatives going in the international arena in the last years trying to address this issue. We got REAIM last year, which is a summit between 60 countries that they mainly spoke about the different usages of AI in the military field. Also in 2024, we got the European Council Framework Convention for Artificial Intelligence, or AI Convention as everyone call it. And it was the first of its kind, and it's an international treaty, so it's a good step pushing this accountability question. And there's the UN too. So there have been some talks in the latest meetings of the CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. They are trying to rekindle this debate around lethal autonomous weapons, drones, uses of AI in war. The problem is, we know how these international regulatory frameworks work, especially in the geopolitical scenario we have right now.
I totally agree that these kind of frameworks are useless if the states that commit more war crimes, like the US and Israel, are not held accountable by them. And in many cases, they don't even sign these kind of treaties, they don't participate in the process. However, I think that you also touch on a key issue here, and you say, well, how can we get control of this process? And one of the things that I've been seeing lately is that we are assuming, and this is also part of how the hype of AI goes on, that this is something that's mechanical or natural or inevitable, that AI will be like this and we will develop in these ways, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. And this is a discourse that's very favorable for the capitalists that are actually taking the decisions to develop AI. So we need to question these narratives and ask ourselves how we can create, as a society, ways of making these people responsible for what they're doing. In this and in other aspects. When we talk about how AI and the drones are used in war, I think that a second ethical issue that sometimes is being presented is more in utilitarian terms. All of us were familiar with that not so smart branch of ethics,
Okay.
but let me try to reconstruct the argument. So the idea here is like, is AI more or less precise than human operators of drones? For example, it could be argued that the accuracy of a human operator in terms of the amount of civilian casualties or, I don't know, mistaking identities and these kind of errors is a certain percentage, while AI has another percentage. So use of AI would be okay or would be accepted if AI is better, is more efficient from a utilitarian point of view than a human operator. But there's a lot of preconceptions that are already cooked in the argument. Like, this is the correct way of doing war. We need to do this kind of assassinations. This is legal. This is the way in which things should be done. But I think that even if we accept these kind of premises that are unspoken, we should be very careful to take this argument seriously, because We can see this in the Italian doghead or in the case that you mentioned, no, the machine guns. That for them, they thought airplanes would lead to less instead of more casualties. Machine guns will lead to less death. But what happened was the opposite. And if the killing machine is more efficient, maybe the percentage of mistake is reduced, but it is used more. So the absolute number or the total number of civilians that are killed by these machines increased. And this is not even considering the externalities of AI. I don't know, water consumption, rare earth consumption, and these kinds of things. So for me, at least, the arguments for using AI in the military are not very convincing. But what do you think?
Do you know why I spoke about Dewey? Why I wanted to use him? Because not only because he was crazy about an invention and said what he said, tried to be a prophet. That too, but in the military today, in the Pentagon especially, we have a lot of Dewey. Guys like military thinkers that are stubborn and think they know everything and take everything for granted. So I feel I have to become the devil's advocate on this one. Because from a purely operational perspective, AI is something totally valid. In most cases, a drone strike will be more precise and less costly than a conventional plain one. AI-based facial recognition and profiling programs are faster than having dozens of human analysts checking social media for clues, etc., potential targets. And it's crazy for me to say that, but imagine that I'm one of those Dewey, okay? Who cares about collateral damage in a wedding party if you can save yourself the trouble of sending a tactical team to the ground in a remote countryside village in Iraq? Especially talking about damage, perhaps this is the only human cost they take into consideration, their own soldiers. We are seeing with our own eyes that Palestine is being carpet bombed. Israel has missiles with pinpoint accuracy. They use that in Iran right now. So if they are doing carpet bombing, it's because they don't see Palestinians as people. So they don't care about the collateral damage. They don't care about the mistakes of AI. So from a military point of view, unfortunately, the arguments to use AI, they are completely convincing. And the mistakes, in my opinion, for them are just bonuses.
No, I agree, and I think it's a great expansion of what I was talking about from the more utilitarian or ethical point of view. This is a kind of hidden presupposition that we need to face when we talk about these arguments, because on the face of it is logical, but when we ask ourselves which lives matter, which lives don't matter, why are we using these criteria as the basic criteria? Like global south lives, of course, they are not important for the imperialist military forces, but this is not something that we have to agree on. In fact, we have to push on these exact ideas to question the narrative of how good AI will be for a war. And changing the topic a little bit. For now, we've been talking about how technology can be used in warfare and about how AI can be used in warfare. But that is not the only dimension in which technology has an impact in war. Another aspect that we should discuss, I think, is how it influences our experience of war as spectators. We have come a long way since the first war in Iraq. That, if I remember correctly, that was the first to be transmitted live on TV, I don't know, by CNN, this kind of thing. Now we not only have immediate information about, for example, the genocide in Gaza, but we can also see some kind of public reaction to what's going on.
Oh no, please don't even start. You know I could talk hours about this thing, right?
I know you can talk hours, and maybe I will let you talk some minutes after, but first, let me do some disclaimers that I think are important for the setting of the discussion. Social media, we all know, is not a representative sample of the population. Twitter is not society, Reddit is not society. In the case of war, in particular, when we see hashtags or we see the topic of war in the social media, it's so sensitive to voting, to troll farms and misinformation operations from different actors. So this is something that we have to take into account when we discuss this phenomenon. But some things can be considered authentic reaction. For example, one small detail I notice every time there's a new conflict in the world, a new war, the hashtag World War III will start to trend everywhere. And my first and honest reaction is that this is stupid. And this trivializes both the history of the world wars and the real suffering in current conflict. But I also think that it deserves some study. And what are your impressions on this? And in general, and the phenomenon of Twitter experts, hashtag geopolitics, and armchair generals?
It's difficult even to start. What I hate the most are the Twitter influencers. First, because most of them, they don't have the right understanding of international relations, history, so they lack theory. And this is a big problem. Even when they have good intentions, they identify themselves as a leftist and etc. They end up by spreading confusion, panic, all this kind of paranoia that we know today. And I will use this opportunity to talk bad things about AI. So the second thing is that most of the content they produce, since they don't have knowledge, they lack any profundity because it's from a chatbot. So they try to sum up years of conflict and history in a series of tweets with some shocking pictures, and that's it. And the replies are even worse. Because go to Twitter, you will see someone, a smart guy, replying to this kind of paranoia with his own paranoia that was generated by a different chatbot. I don't know. And not to mention the people who keep asking Grok, is this true? For the most basic historical facts you can imagine. So Twitter became impossible. It's unimaginable. So
And then there is the problem of how social media affects our perception of time. What do you think about that?
people think that wars are like an action film. Maybe not even an action film. An action film would be too long for them. TikTok, maybe. The states they need to mobilize and act instantly to everything they judge worth acting for. I don't want to be a dictator, okay, in the sense that I am trying to dictate how you should use social media. I know what is social media. I know everyone has the right to complain about whatever they want to complain or tweet their aspirations in geopolitics or whatever. What bothers me is that these Twitter analysts, they are so entitled. So I think I will go for this weapon fetish thing. Most of these people, since they don't know anything about theory, right? They go for the weapons and they are crazy about this missile that US sent or that plane that Israel has. It's going to solve everything and it's game over. But it's not how things work. We know that. Wars aren't films and states, they shouldn't behave like characters from hero movies. This is beyond stupid. And I'm tired of seeing people complaining about country X should nuke country Y. Like, an atomic bomb is not a joke, at least not for me. So everyone is trying to encapsulate everything in power scaling. You're not reviewing an anime.
I see that you are presenting another polemical perspective today. Once again, we faced this situation many times, but this is another episode in which we have to say something very, very polemic. Nuclear bombing is bad.
Well, yes.
This is one of the problems that we have when we see these conversations in the internet, that you have to clarify nuclear bombing is bad, because for many people, they cannot understand such a simple concept. So that's why I don't think that criticizing these phenomena and these people is dictatorial, because we are just trying to understand how these forms of public speech influence society. On a more personal level, what I like to wonder about is how new is this phenomenon and how can we understand the changes in this social way of understanding war? Because we live in a pre-internet society for many, many years, or at least a pre-social media society. We are somewhat old.
Well, yeah,
I'm not saying that some people live. No, no. You and me, we live in this pre-social media society, so we have a memory.
the good old times.
Yeah, and the armchair generals, they always existed. Maybe before you went to a bar and some drunk would tell you all his thoughts about this war or that war. And I admit it, I was the drunk. But even if this phenomenon existed in previous times, it was not so widespread and it didn't have the same impact. There is like an amplifying effect going on in which the bar drunks before were more or less dispersed, now are all together in that place in hell which we call Twitter.
Exactly. What happened in the bar stayed in the bar. You know, the drunk would comment about, I don't know, the Gulf War, say some absurdity, and then, okay, it's over. You go home, and he will go home eventually. But now there's this amplifying effect, you say, and it's awful.
Exactly. There was a transformation, I think, between a public space like a bar that was limited to a single part of the town or the city or whatever, to a public space that's really public, since now literally everyone can see it, everyone can participate in it. And as we said, we are old, and I still remember the times in which this was thought as a good change. There was optimism that social media was going to change society for the better. It was going to promote democracy, human rights, and whatever. And this was very, very long time ago, like 10 years ago. Many of our listeners weren't born at the time.
Oh, yeah.
So now we know it's not true. And we know that social media is not doing these kind of things. But what many people don't realize is why. The blame is not the internet or social media or AI in abstract. These technologies can be good. They can help us in many, many ways, and they do help us in many ways. But the logic of capitalist development and how it pushes certain research programs of internet, of AI, of social media is harmful for human society. Because for a company, the most important thing is to make a profit, not if this is good or bad for your health, this is good or bad for your country or your society or whatever. They only have one thing in their mind.
Everything is about money, no? I know some people, they do that just because they are fascinated by this game of let me win an online argument. Okay, I get it. It's not my cup of tea anymore. But other people, they do that precisely because of capitalism. We are seeing a lot of monetized accounts going around in different social media. So they will spill all absurdities you can ever conceive just because they know some smart guy with internet access is going to devote all his time and energy to argue against them. And of course, he or she, or I don't know, will give all the engagement they need. So for me, it's no wonder that many music entertainment focused accounts, they are giving hot takes regarding geopolitical mainstream events because this is a magic formula to farm shares and likes. So it's a bit sad to see what social media became. And I don't know, I must admit, when I see these Taylor Swift pages, you know, or something talking about disasters or wars, conflicts, I really want to abandon everything, you know, destroy all my electronic devices and go back to the mountains. I don't want the internet anymore.
Yeah, go back to a cave, my friend. Become monk. I think that you touch on another important thing, that monetization is also related to how we act in the internet and how we are trying to get engagement all the time. And one of the effects of current social media, or one of the ways in which social media is working, is to look for a reaction. And it's trying to make a hierarchy of opinions and to show us the opinions that it knows it will create a reaction from us. So this creates a distortion in how we perceive the state of public discourse. For example, if we go back to the drunk in the bar, in real life, you will listen to the drunk, but you will have readily available elements to dismiss his opinions as invalid, since he's, after all, a drunk in a bar.
Right.
But in Twitter, the same person with an alcohol issue appears as a tweet that has been shared many times and is trending, and this gives certain legitimacy. And social media will promote this content because it's going to provoke an emotional reaction. So the content that talks about World War III will rapidly jump to the top since it's controversial, it's apocalyptic, it creates anxiety. Even if, as G.I. Joe used to say, knowing is half the battle, even if we know about this way of functioning of social media, when we engage in this app, we are still falling into the trap because we cannot be vigilant all day, fact checking everything like some alienated and overexploited Washington Post intern. We just use them, we just doom scroll.
Well, I think it's enough talking about losers on the internet, no? Especially since we are not so far from them. Instead, what we could do is take this question seriously. What would be our definition of world war? Since everything we've seen so far, it's just rubbish. Because I think this question opens up several topics for us, no? We can talk about deterrence theory, proxy wars, the history of warfare in the 20th century. That is something that no one mentions in the internet, in the internet discussion. And for me, these are key to understand what is going on right now. So I would like to ask you, my friend, what's the best way to define a world war?
This is a difficult question because I don't think we can say we're in a world war right now. But maybe we should first interrogate how did this get framed this way? And I think it's possible to relate this to the idea of how these overreactions and exaggerations that we have been discussing, from AI hype, armchair generals, world wars, etc. There are ways to deflect our attention from what is going on right now to what could possibly happen in the future. So instead of looking at the conflicts that are happening, we're already trying to anticipate what is going to come. And maybe I didn't make it clear before, but it's not that I think that anticipating the future is useless. But this prepper attitude needs to be related also to the present. It cannot only be constant anticipation.
Yeah, that's exactly what we spoke in the first section, no? People are more worried about these future problems than looking what is happening in front of their eyes. And everything about this internet feeling that every social interaction can have more than 20 seconds to unfold itself. I don't know, major international historical events, you name it. They are not a TikTok, right? The things need time to happen.
Precisely. If we want to provide a definition of what World War is, we have to start in the First World War. But ironically, people at first they call it the Great War. They didn't know it was a world war or didn't develop this concept until later. And if you think about how the world developed itself, it had an escalating sequence. No, it started with the murder of Franz Ferdinand, at least in the traditional narrative, and step by step started involving several of the world powers due to their alliances. And then these world powers brought soldiers from the colonial countries, and later still the US got involved. So it was a long process, it was not immediate. And even if we think about World War II, it was different to this because, first of all, there's some debate regarding where it started. Some people will say China in 1937, the Japanese invaded China in Shanghai, and others would say Poland 1939, the Nazi invasion of Poland. It doesn't matter which one we choose, but from the start, the war had a global dimension. This was different with the escalating style of the First World War. Even with only 2 cases, we cannot create a unique model of how a world war should start. And so that's why I think it's very difficult to predict, because these are names that are applied retrospectively once we already know what happened. But maybe what we can recognize is when a world war is in progress, not when it starts, but when it's already in development. I believe that there are two important data points that can help us do this. The first, if there is a direct involvement of all the major powers and all the major world powers in the conflict. Not only one or two, there's a general involvement of the major powers. Right now, we have a war between Russia and Ukraine, or Israel and Iran, or maybe we could mention to the conflict between Pakistan and India that was happened some weeks ago. But the major powers like China or the EU, they are not directly involved. They are not fighting each other. Of course, this could change at any moment. And the second element that will have to be present for me is total war, because that was such an important fact of the world wars and something that was shared by both. So if we look at this definition, yeah, at the moment we are not in a world war. But what do we have then? We have a number of proxy wars that involve some of the great powers, like the role that the US and the European Union are playing in the Ukraine Russia war, or the aiding and abetting of the genocide in Gaza. And I don't want to talk much about the Iran and Israel situation because it's something that's going on right now. But for the moment, at least it looks like it will be another regional war with the involvement of the US. And as we discussed in one of our first episodes, the first or the second, but it's not surprising that the US is almost always involved, because since they are the hegemonic power in the world system, they play the role of global police.
Okay, I think I can follow your reasoning and state that there's no world war since there's no direct involvement of the major powers and no total war, of course. But another way of seeing this, it would be by starting from the assumption that since the advent of the ICBM and other good, efficient delivery systems, there will be no world wars anymore. Maybe this is not another way of seeing it. It's more like a new understanding of what you say. For me, there's no possibility of total war. Or I could say even direct involvement when it comes to nuclear powers. The definition of total war, if we go a textbook definition, is that total war means a country using everything that it possesses, all the national resources, human strength, to contribute to the war effort. Also, there is no discrimination of civilian or military targets, and laws of war, well, they become just a piece of paper. In other words, total war is a fight for survival. In a fight for survival, for your own existence, you will not hesitate to use a weapon that can give you a chance of winning, even if winning means dragging your enemy and, par consequence, the rest of humanity to chaos with you. So, how can we have total war in this scenario?
That's great. That's the type of nuance that we need to add to these conversations when we discuss these things, because even if we have a working definition, the one that I proposed, it's not that I think it's the best definition, but I think it's a definition that works at up to some point. But is this something that can really happen? For me, that's a totally valid question, and you bringing this is perfect. But also, another thing is like, is this really useful to make this comparison now? And in which ways it is useful to compare things like this?
I want to go further because for me, I believe people should stop looking for the new Franz Ferdinand, a single event that is going to trigger a chain reaction and drag all countries to unrestricted warfare. So we don't have entente cordiale anymore. There's no binding agreement to drag everyone into a war. And again, let's state the obvious. The BRICS, for example, it's not a military bloc. a military alliance. People are saying that, so they are totally disconnected from reality. And talking about being disconnected, this is also something important. We need to have a historical distancing to understand when something happens. You know, you just mentioned that you're not going to talk about Iran, Israel, because it's something that is going on right now. And you're totally right. You can't interpret the major consequences of an incident, of an episode, at the same time the episode is going on. And we spoke enough about this internet hysteria, this eternal sense of urgency. So, what I want to say, I will sound a bit contradictory, I don't know, or maybe too abstract. But what if we adapt our definitions of world war? I'm not saying to put aside the definitions we have, okay? But at the same time, we need to understand what is going on. It's not because we can't have the historical distancing needed that we must close our eyes, right? We need to understand what is going on. So I was having a conversation with my former professor some time ago, and he told me that he felt we were living a revival of 1920, 1930s. I tend to agree with that for reasons we spoke in the previous episodes, like the UN is failing to solve global problems, US is faltering in its hegemony. So what I want to say is, let me give an example. In 1938, the people behind the Munich agreement, the agreement that allowed Germany to take over Czechoslovakia, they would never imagine that 1 year later Europe would be at war. In the same way, how could anyone predict that the Agadir crisis in 1911 was a prelude to the First World War, something happening in Morocco? So historical distancing is needed, but we also need to make the connection. Do you understand?
Yes, I think that I agree a bit on the part that some historical distance is needed in order to understand how things will develop. But you're right too that there are some practical needs involved in the question. One thing is questioning the possibility of predicting the future, no? Of saying, well, what if AI will become conscious and become an AGI, and what will we do? And we need to create regulation. So if this happens, we are ready with some law or whatever. And another different question is, well, is this conflict, is this world situation a world war? And in the second case, what we're asking is, well, if it's a world war, what should be our policy? Because, for example, during the First World War, the majority of the socialist movement broke up into pieces. One part of the socialists, what we would call the social democrats, they supported the war. And another group, the semi-liberal left, that included people like Lenin or Rosa Luxemburg, they opposed the war. But in the Second World War, because the war was against the Soviet Union, among others, the communist parties, they presented this policy of popular front, of making a front with people who were not communists because it was needed to stop Hitler, no? And that makes sense too. So when we're asking, is this a world war or what types of wars are we facing, we're asking a more practical question. What policies should we have to face this issue? And I get it that from a scientific or a historiographic standpoint, it's something that we cannot do in a sense, or it's not so scientific to ask this question. But we are involved in politics, so we cannot completely abstain ourselves from the discussion of the current situation. Even if we're wrong, in order to design our politics, we have to take a stance. And as Hegel used to say, the owl of Minerva takes flight only at dusk, but we are not owls.
Oh,
Sorry, you are trying to recover from this fact. Yes, we are not owls. We can add this to our list of facts. No, nuclear bombs are bad. Humans are not owls. We're creating a set of truth here.
Yeah, that's perfect. But let me go back. I say that I can see a World War III happen. But it's not that I mean that there's nothing going on. I don't know if I was clear enough.
You were clear. You were clear.
Well, I say that I mentioned that updating the definitions or having a new definition, this abstraction. Because for me, maybe now this is our world war, the world war we have. The balance of power is being reorganized in different ways, and the proxy wars are one of those ways. The ways that the major powers they can stress their influence around the world. You just mentioned what is going on in terms of wars. We have the war in Ukraine that is making Europe rearm itself. They have this readiness 2030, the plan is ready. Volkswagen is doing tanks again. And Russia is having a big role in world politics again. Israel is pushing for expansion at the expense of all other people who live in the region, with the consent of the global community, of course. Well, the Far East, if we go for strict military terms, there's nothing going on, right? This situation is stable, but we know that the US won't stop pressuring Taiwan. And Japan, well, Japan, it's fantastic, right? They keep flirting with remilitarization, and we know this is not a good sign. So this is my take. I think we are living a world war already. This endless cycle of conflicts involving us, the global south, maintained by capitalism, of course. So I think that being a doomerist or going online to speculate about nuclear strikes every day, it's worse than stupid. I don't even have a word. Because it just helped the major powers involved in the conflicts that are going on. While the Twitter analysts, like, they keep waiting for something worse to happen, like, okay, now they're going to use the bigger bomb. People in the periphery, they are dying every minute. So we are living a world.
I have to say that in this last part of your argument, you lost me a little bit.
No! Don't say that.
I will question the idea that we're in a world war because that's why I wanted to put a precise definition of the concept. We need to avoid this kind of concept slippage where everything is a world war or anything can be a world war. And of course, I agree that the world is in flux. There are conflicts, there is imperialism, but that's not a world war because war is not the central fact of all this. Maybe in the sense, well, in a certain sense, we can talk about a class war, but class war is not limited to the global south, but it's like the key feature of capitalism itself, or even if we follow the manifesto of history itself. And I noticed that you and me, we have a difference sometimes between our understanding of the concept of imperialism. That can be found also in the episode in which we talked about doomerism, because we both agree that imperialism is one of the central phenomenons in this epoch. But for me, imperialism is something that impacts both the people who live in the imperial core and in the colonial and semi-colonial countries. Because, yes, in the imperial core there is a labor aristocracy, as Lenin would say, and some people living there receive benefits from imperialism. But there are also broad swaths of the population that live in, we could say, global south conditions and are oppressed by imperialism in many ways, like proletarian, ethnic, or gender minorities, proletarian women, proletarian indigenous peoples, and so on. So, although imperialism is a key contradiction, class conflict is the central contradiction, and we need to have a proper intersectional understanding of this in order to create the alliances that will be able to destroy the capitalist system. And I know you agree with these ideas too.
Yeah, I do.
It's not that we don't agree, it's that we have a difference of emphasis that sometimes translates into how we use the concept. And this is a valid debate within Marxism of which is the main contradiction, which is the secondary contradiction, and so on.
Oh, okay, yeah. We agree. We see things from different angles, maybe. This understanding that I have from imperialism, it comes from the left, of course. It's Marxism, but I think you have a more pure Marxist view. But let me go back. You want a more technical definition. And let me try to explain in another way. Why do I think this is a world war? Because there's not going to be a third one. Precisely because of that. Let's go back to total war. Imagine that the countries, the global powers, they decide to wage a war. The major players, they do an agreement before, it's a duel. Let's not use nuclear weapons, and let's not attack in an indiscriminate fashion. So no civilian targets, etc. It's not total war. It's not a fight for survival. You understand what I'm trying to say? If the countries they use all their resources for war, they are going to use nuclear weapons because it's a fight for survival. Nuclear deterrence, they changed the game in a way that this major changes in the that are going to happen in the international system, they are not going to be in the same way. They are not going to happen in the same way like it was in the previous century. So we are not going to see huge armies mobilizing across different theaters around the world, or households like handing the metal items to prepare tanks and melt them to make bombs, using oil to prepare bombs. This is not going to happen anymore. This is past. We are just talking about AI, right? So what we have now are proxy wars, like the Cold War, with people from the global south playing the blood price for the big players. So unless I'm wrong, and I think you and our listeners, they are hoping that I'm not wrong too, right? We are not going to see a third world war in the same fashion of the first and the second, because the third world war will be the last.
Yeah, well, I hope you are wrong in the sense that this does not happen, but yeah, maybe it will be the last war. That is also something that could happen.
But then there will be no debate. You understand what I'm trying to say? So there's no point of debating a third world war if it is going to be the last one. You know that the travel time of ICBM, it's fast. You don't have time to tweet.
No, no, let me say it like this. There is some point in debating if the major powers are going to push us into total destruction, because we need to do something to stop it in that case. If that's a real possibility that we're thinking about. I'm actually not thinking about it, but it doesn't sound crazy to me that if the major powers start a hot war between them, this could eventually lead to the use of nuclear weapons. And well, that sounds very scary, but it's not totally out of the realm of the possible. What it is very depressing, I have to say. And one of the problems of the current discussions of technology and warfare is how this kind of hype that we have been describing, no, it obscures the real issues that are created by technological advancement. So many people, as we discussed, they are talking about how advances are going to change warfare for the better. It's going to make it more safe, more accurate, faster, with less casualties. And on the other hand, some other people will adopt the doomer viewpoint, no, and will believe that technology and nuclear weapons or whatever, they are the main problem of warfare. But one of the things that is obscured by this dilemma is that warfare and politics are intimately related. The conflict between countries or the conflict between states is not some kind of rational zero sum game in which everyone is going to take the best determination using their knowledge about their weapons, their military forces, or whatever. People are going to act in rational and in irrational ways. So we need to understand not only the technological side of things, but also the political side of things. And this is not some key discovery I'm making. Like anyone familiar with Clausewitz will know this. But still, I think that in this kind of internet debates or what journalists like to write about, this is easily forgotten. No? Some days ago, CNN and the New York Times were describing how bad would it be to bomb Iran, but today we see, wow, such nice weapons, such nice missiles were used, such a beautiful military operation. And we're talking about a military operation that's bombing nuclear plants, which could be disastrous for the environment. So I was going to ask you this: how can we revalue the role of politics in these discussions? How can we add value to this by putting politics back into military?
But just before, I just want to comment that you say that CNN, like it's saying that how beautiful war is. I just saw like one of these pages, these analysts of Twitter comparing the silhouette of the B-2 bomber, the one who attacked Iran right now with the bunker destroyer, with a bird, and say, you see how good, if we mimic God's creation, we can have good results. So comparing a B-2 bomber with a God creation, like the levels of craziness of these people are really something. But going for war and politics, I will go for these people, these crazy boys that just think about missiles and shapes of planes. And then really, I'm not talking about myself. I mean, there is a reason why we still quote Clausewitz and Swins when it comes to war and strategy. They didn't focus the energy talking about an ultimate weapon that would change the face of warfare. I know, again, today we are the Captain Obvious, right? But focusing more on the strategy and the political aspects that surround what a war is, it's precisely what makes Clausewitz Swings so unique. So, just to give some examples, okay? Swings spoke about cavalry, in the art of war. But in the book, he don't say that horses are the final tool to defeat any kind of enemy. The same way Clausewitz, he gave emphasis to a decisive battle. The thing is, everyone forgot what came later. The generals of Germany that came after the unified Germany, they were obsessed with this idea of decisive battle. Later, the Japanese too. But everyone seems to forget that the center of gravity, the concept of the center of gravity of Clausewitz, involved politics too. War, for him, never meant to be an end in itself. So, because of these misinterpretations and just thinking about weapons, the bigger the weapon, the better, we saw many mistakes happening in wars around the world, with both generals that were disconnected from politics and political leaders who failed to understand why they should or why they should not wage war.
I agree. We can see many cases in history in which there was a disconnect between military and political leaders. And well, I agree that military thinking is something that we have to talk about more as leftists, and probably it's something that we will do more in future episodes. But right now, our time has run out. So see you in 2 weeks, I guess. And in the meantime, please keep safe out there while protesting and challenging the capitalist system. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, which is in fact the truly revolutionary act. So that's it. 再见 and see you in the next episode.
再见。